In the first episode, I explained how the Roman fort at Brancaster may have been built to protect a new port and entrepot. I argued that its construction was linked to events on the continent, where the existing supply system was threatened by barbarian incursions, which had disrupted agricultural production and led to depopulation. However, supplying the army over a longer maritime route was a significant undertaking. When the shore forts at Brancaster, Caister and Reculver were built, sometime in the mid-3rd century, Germania Inferior was still garrisoned by 2 legions, which were probably supported by a similar number of auxiliary troops. For the Roman commissariat, the logistical problem was that the daily grain ration of a Roman soldier weighed about 0.85 kilograms. Thus, just to feed the army in Germania Inferior, which may have numbered 20,000 men, over 6,000 tons of wheat or barley would have been needed annually. This excludes any provision for cavalry horses or draft animals. Furthermore, as well as grain, each soldier would also have expected a daily ration of wine, vinegar, and meat. So how did this new supply system work in practice? Dedications recovered from the sea, close to the lost port of Guanuenta in the Netherlands, show that between the 1st and 3rd centuries, merchants and ship owners from the provinces of northwest Europe were engaged in an extensive trade network. This enabled supplies purchased or requisitioned by the imperial authorities to be transported on its behalf. Thus, to begin with, the army may have placed a greater reliance upon the existing logistical system. How these arrangements were subsequently affected by Diocletian's financial reforms is uncertain. These marked a transition from a private enterprise style economy to one based largely upon imperial command. Now the Praetorian prefect was responsible for specifying the taxes in kind which were to be raised in each province. It was these supplies which, if needed, could be transported over long distances that were to be used to feed and maintain the army. In this regard, several laws in the Theodosian Code explain that certain estates were to be exempted from the land tax on the grounds that boats and ships would be built instead. The size of these craft also appears to have been specified by the imperial authorities, presumably so that sufficient capacity would always be available to transport whatever supplies had been requisitioned by the provincial governors. As delivery was also a public duty, shipmasters, like many other professions, were now organised into hereditary guilds, which must have made it easier to administer the new arrangements. Few shipwrecks have been found from the Roman period. However, one factor which the ancient shipwrights must have considered is that most of the coastline between Brancaster and the Rhine estuary is comprised of shingle and sand, and in places there are relatively few natural harbours. Thus, a vessel caught up in a storm ran the risk of being grounded and then rolled over and broken up by the surf. To avoid such a mishap, it appears the Romans chose to construct flat-bottomed ships which could navigate shallow water and beach or anchor safely before a storm gathered strength. A flat-bottomed vessel also provided greater flexibility when it came to loading or unloading cargo, whilst if beached, a crew could rest on shore whilst waiting for the tide to turn or for a change in the weather. We should not be surprised that the Romans chose to build such vessels. Today, flat-bottomed ships are still used to navigate the shallow seas which fringe the east coast. This sailing barge, the Juno, was berthed in Blakeney Harbour. The unpredictability of where a Roman vessel might land, especially in poor weather, may help to explain why no permanent fortifications seem to have been built between the main Saxon shore forts. Instead, each journey would have been influenced by the wind and the tides, and marked by several different stopping points. We know that grain was regularly shipped from Britain to Germania because the Roman historian Ammianus tells us as much. He writes that when Julian, whose statue is shown here, was appointed Caesar in 355 AD, he restored the granaries along the lower Rhine so they could receive British grain. In a letter to the Athenians, Julian goes on to explain how after a war with the German tribes, he freed 20,000 Roman civilians who had been held captive. To help feed these people until the next harvest, Julian assembled a fleet of 600 ships, 400 of which were newly constructed to transport British grain to the continent. The fact that so many ships were required indicates that delivery probably took place in one consignment, and this may have been the usual practice, as the crop had to be cut, threshed, dried and delivered to the continent before the autumn storms. Within this context, the Barland's farm boat, found on the edge of the Severn estuary, may provide an example of the type of craft which could have been used to transport grain or other products to an entrepot at Brancaster. In his excavation report, McGrain estimates that when carrying a cargo of 4.57 tons, this boat only had a draft of 0.45 metres. Such a vessel would have been ideal to traverse the shallow waters of the Wash and the navigable rivers which flow into it. However, a ship with a larger hold, which was more seaworthy, would have been required to transport grain or other cargo across the North Sea to Germania. The merchant ship discovered at Blackfriars may provide an example of such a vessel. Peter Marsden, who excavated the site on the south bank of the Thames, reports that this was a flat-bottomed craft constructed by laying two keel planks side by side, which were then joined by a central seam. This ship was about 18.5 metres long and had a beam of 6.1 metres. Teredo infestation suggests it had once been a sea-going vessel. When it sank, the Blackfriars ship was carrying a cargo of ragstone, but its hold was large enough to accommodate 18.4 tons of grain. Marsden calculates that with a full hold, its draft would have been between 1 and 1.5 metres. Such a vessel would have been able to sail close to the shore, whilst its flat bottom would have provided extra stability in calm waters and helped to prevent its cargo from shifting. How these Roman ships may have appeared when beached can be seen in this painting by the Dutch artist Abraham Hulk. It shows how a flat-bottomed vessel can sit on a beach without mishap, waiting to refloat on a rising tide. In the case of the Roman shipwreck found outside the entrance to St. Peter Port Harbour on the Isle of Guernsey, cone-shaped nails used for caulking were driven into the vessel's keel so they wouldn't be damaged when the ship grounded. A slightly different approach was taken with the Blackfriars ship, for although the nail heads protruded beyond the keel, they were wider and flattened at the top to make them more robust for when the ship hit the beach. We will never know how much grain was transported from Britain to the continent, but if 200 vessels of the type found at Blackfriars were assembled each autumn to convey British grain to storehouses in Germania, then over 3,500 tons may have been exported annually. In theory, this would have been sufficient to feed 11 to 12,000 soldiers for up to a year. There is some evidence that other products may also have been exported from the Saxon Shore Forts to the continent. For example, an examination of the animal bones found at Brancaster showed a bias towards more mature beasts, which has led to a suggestion that younger cattle and sheep may have been slaughtered on site and their carcasses transported elsewhere. A similar conclusion was drawn from the cattle bones recovered at Caister, whilst the animal enclosures found at Othona were also linked to large-scale butchery and the supply of meat to other sites. To conclude, any army depends upon a reliable system of supply. However, what is not often mentioned is how centralised and organised this Roman system may have become. By treating shipbuilding as a tax in kind and specifying the number and size of vessels to be constructed and maintained, the imperial authorities had a controlling influence not only over what was produced, but how it was transported. Thus, at times of instability on the continent, Britain may have provided grain, meat and other byproducts such as gut and hides, which helped the Rhine army to remain active in the field. It was Britain's agricultural surplus, shipped to Germania via the Saxon Shore Forts, which sustained the legions and helped to prevent a military withdrawal.